This video is about factoring completely. So this time we want to make sure that all of our factoring is complete. The first thing that you're always going to want to check is, can you factor out a greatest common factor? If there are 4 terms, you're going to use factor by grouping method. If there are 3 terms, you're either going to do guess and check, or you're going to do the factor by grouping method that we looked at earlier. So our first example is x squared y squared minus 9x squared plus 3y squared minus 27. Since it has 4 terms and there isn't a number or a variable that I can factor out, I'm going to do factor by grouping. So always factor by grouping when you have 4 terms. So x squared y squared minus 9x squared is going to go in our first group. Always put a plus sign in between your 2 groups, and then 3y squared minus 27 in your second group. Factor out the common factor. The common factor between x squared y squared and negative 9x squared is x squared. And what we'll have left in our parentheses then is y squared minus 9 plus 3y squared minus 27. We can factor a 3 out of there, and we'll be left with y squared minus 9. So now in our parentheses, and when you do factor by grouping, this should always happen, is that in the parentheses you should have the same thing. It's y squared plus 9, so we're going to factor that out. When we factor it out of this first part here, we're going to be left with x squared. And when we factor it out of the second part, we're going to be left with plus 3. Notice now y squared minus 9 is the difference of 2 perfect squares, so it will factor again. And remember, when we factor the difference of 2 perfect squares, we take the square root of the first thing, and the square root of y squared is y, and then plus the square root of the second thing, and the square root of 9 is 3, so we have y plus 3. And then the second factor is exactly the same, except for the sign in the middle, so that's going to be y minus 3. And then don't forget we have the x squared plus 3 on the end there. So our final answer is y plus 3 times y minus 3 times x squared plus 3. Our next example, x cubed minus 2x squared minus 36x plus 27. So again, 4 terms. We're going to use factor by grouping on this. X cubed minus 2x squared minus, close your group off. Always put a plus sign in between your 2 groups, and then negative 36x plus 72 in the second group. We can factor an x squared out of the first group, and we'll be left with x minus 2. In the second group, we can factor out a negative 36, and we'll be left with x minus 2 again. And so now, again, in the parentheses, we have x minus 2 is the same, so we're going to factor that out. And when we factor it out of the first part, we're going to be left with x squared. And when we factor it out of the second part, we'll be left with negative 36. And again, x squared minus 36 is the difference of 2 perfect squares, so we can factor that. So that's x minus 2 times the quantity, take the square root of x, that's x, and then plus the square root of 36 is 6, and then the other factor is x minus 6. So this one factors as x minus 2 times x plus 6 times x minus 6. Our next example, 18x to the 4th minus 2x squared. So there's only 2 terms here. We do have a common factor. It's 2x squared. So when we factor the 2x squared out, we'll be left with 9x squared minus 1. Again, 9x squared minus 1 is a perfect square. The difference of 2 perfect squares, so we have 2x squared, and then the square root of 9x squared is 3x, and then it's going to be plus, the square root of 1 is 1, and then repeat that, only change the sign to a minus. So this factors as 2x squared times the quantity 3x plus 1 and 3x minus 1. In our last example here, 2x cubed y plus 8x squared y squared minus 10xy cubed. So 10xy cubed So again, we only have 3 terms here, not 4, so we're not going to do factor by grouping, but there is a common factor. All of these numbers are divisible by 2, and all of these have an x, and the smallest power of x that's represented here is the x, so it's going to be a plain old x. And then we have y, y squared, and y cubed, so we can also factor out a y. And 2x cubed y divided by 2xy is going to be x squared. And 8x squared y squared divided by 2xy is going to be plus 4xy. And then negative 10xy cubed is going to be minus 5. And then the x's cancel when you do that division, and then y cubed divided by y is y squared. So now this polynomial inside the parentheses will factor. We have 2xy, and we're going to have 2 groups here. And the way that we would factor the x squared is x and x. And then the last term has to be a negative 5y squared. So the last term part is going to contain a y. And we just need to figure out how to factor the negative 5. So the sum will give us this positive 4. And so that's going to be positive 5 and negative 1. So this one factors as 2xy times the quantity x plus 5y times x minus y. And that is the end of our lecture on factoring completely. Let me know if you have questions.